I wanted to share really some of the data. So I guess Frank came up with a question, which is a brilliant question, which is why do some CEOs or do CEOs not believe this McKinsey data? I'm citing now a couple of slides from the McKinsey report, which was produced in May 2020. They've produced a number of brilliant reports, but we wanted to take this one and really bring it to life briefly. It's 60 pages long, so I'm assuming you've not read it, because I probably would have read it all, but there's some brilliant stuff in there, and I wanted to save you a lot of time really and put together 4 or 5 which we think are the killer slides which we need to focus on, and I think it will provide some really good context for the session. So I'm just going to share these slides. Can you see the slides? Are they up?
We can indeed, thank you.
Great stuff. So McKinsey & Company, so massive thank you to them. We've not had any engagement with them on this, but I'm sure that they would be delighted that we're all 70 or 80 of us discussing this. I think it's a dream for anyone who writes a report that it would end up being discussed in a forum like this. So as a thing out of courtesy for the name check, Vivian Hunt, who's a senior partner of McKinsey & Company in London, Sunditao Dixon File, who is a McKinsey & Company in London, senior partner. We've got Sarah Prince, who also produced a report from Atlanta, McKinsey, and also Kevin Dolan, senior partner from McKinsey & Company in Chicago. So a huge thank you to the 4 of them, because I think it's a fantastic piece of work, tons of insights. And of course, we're all benefiting from their hard efforts, as well as a number of the contributing companies who contributed to the report. So a couple of things, one just to cover off in terms of where the data came from. So there's a few things here, lots of countries involved in their data set, great piece of research, most continents covered, a whole bunch of industries covered. So again, safe to say, this is a comprehensive look at this, and I don't know how many other organizations would have such good global data on this. There were a few what I would consider to be killer slides or killer pieces of information in here, which I think are really tremendously practical, certainly if this is about engaging with the CEO and leadership team community on such an important topic. So one is this one actually, and just to sort of shortcut this, if you go to the far right hand side of the screen and look at this 2019 data, this is the business case for gender diversity on executive teams, and essentially it's saying now that it's stronger than ever, so much so that you've got a likelihood of a 25% improvement, financial improvement performance versus your comparator set in your industry. I mean, it's a pretty compelling statistic. Imagine going to your CEO and saying, look, we've got something here, and if we did this, then we're likely to see a 25% improved performance versus our comparator set. There's not many CEOs who would argue that that's a bad thing to focus on. So it's a compelling set of data. And there's another slide which I think is really good too, which is this one. So on this one, we're looking at the difference between, they're saying, the impact on this financial performance of both gender and also ethnicity. And I think this is it's a mind-blowing stat as far as I'm concerned, especially on the ethnicity one. This is 36% outperformance in your comparator set in the industry for organizations that have got ethnically diverse organizations versus also 25% on gender. So again, a really sort of I guess you can't argue with that, right? This is great data. This was an interesting one, which I thought I would share from the report, because it says actually A doesn't necessarily equal B, or 2 and 2 aren't 4, if you look at it that way. So organizations that have said, actually, yes, we are positive towards sentiment on diversity, it doesn't necessarily follow that those organizations are necessarily inclusive either. So, we're painting the picture here that there are 2 quite significant and different challenges. Diversity and inclusion are, of course, very 2 different things. And then the final one here, which I thought was brilliant, was there are 5 actions that McKinsey and Company would suggest that organizations focus on. I guess if anyone undertook this research and at the end of it, you'd look at those 5 things and say, well, duh, pretty obvious. We didn't need to go to, 1,000 organizations to find this out. Of course, the data backs it up and it's powerful, but these are 5 very straightforward practical actions that any organization can take action on. So I'm going to read them out, and of course we can share the slides following this. But I think this first one around increased diverse representation, particularly in leadership and critical roles, I mean, one obvious thing. But the power of this now is that you've now got this combined with the compelling data that is, I guess, irrefutable, that suggests that organizations who do this and follow this will outperform their comparator set. So this leaves us with an important question, which is, if that's so compelling and if it's so clear and so brilliant and it represents 1,000 companies across every continent and all these different sectors, then so why do CEOs still not believe the McKinsey data?
I've wrestled with this question for the last 2 years because it is the only place
where you have McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, Harvard, Yale, you name it, that has come out with pretty overwhelming data that says, if you focus on this, you can outperform. So in 1975, when McKinsey came out then with what they called the overhead value analysis, which was basically, as we know it now, downsizing your corporate function. But in 1975, when McKinsey published that report, every company said, okay, we're going to start looking at our cost centers and how do we reduce costs and improve the business. And they jumped at it. 2001, McKinsey comes out with the famous War for Talent paper. Every CEO looks at that and said, yep, we're in a war for talent. We need to mobilize the organization and focus on this. And as the question says, why have they not believed this data? And my view, and actually, it was a bottle of wine Sunday night, so take that where it comes from. And what I realized is, actually, they do believe it, maybe, but they're actually doing the wrong thing. They think they're doing something. And so what they believe they are doing is assimilation. And so here, I think, is the issue. And it's the issue and the difference between assimilation and inclusion. And I'm focusing on the UK in particular, because, in fact, very, very, very few companies are doing inclusion. Most of them are doing assimilation. And the difference is, in my mind, assimilation is, here we are as a company. These are HR leadership, their behaviors, HR policies. This is our company leadership, their behaviors. Here's our engagement strategy. In other words, here is us, and here's our infrastructure. And what we're going to do is that we're going to create all these additive programs, female leadership, Black and Asian leadership, recruitment processes. We're going to create these initiatives to bring people into the organization and then quickly get them to assimilate to who we are. Mm-hmm. And that's what most companies are doing, and that's assimilation. And the CEO is probably ticking the box and saying, yep, I've done it. But in fact, inclusion, and that's where the synergy is, inclusion says we're going to challenge and question the myth of meritocracy. We're going to challenge and question our leadership behaviors, our leadership style, what it takes to be a leader, our HR practices, our HR policies, as well as how we engage in the whole communication. We're going to flex all of that infrastructure to meet this new diverse feeder pool that we are bringing into the organization. Most organizations aren't flexing their infrastructure. They're creating additive programs to bring people on. And then the last thing I would say, and turn back to your question, Howie, is the other thing I realized halfway through the bottle of rosé was that as I went back on my own experiences, because I struggle with this question, and I realized, I used to tell people, that CEOs have a 6-month attention span. That was my viewpoint. And I thought about when I was in the corporate world and I worked on merger and acquisition deals. And everyone promises the synergies to the city. Mm. And those synergies typically take place within 6 months. And the reason why most M&A deals fail is because they don't gather the long-term synergies. Why? Simplistically, CEOs move on after 6 months. And I think that's the other reason why this is so difficult. You throw the data point that the average tenure is 5+ years for a CEO, and the typical culture change program takes 3+ years. And then they kind of have a short-term city sort of mindset of quarterly results. It's just not. It's not part of their DNA. They don't see the results, and then you couple that with a sense that they actually do believe. I've realized they are doing something, but they're just doing the wrong thing.
How do you then get the organization to flex its muscle and its skill and get the functions really engaged in making this happen? And I wonder whether the answer in many cases is actually education, because I've certainly found that people just don't know. They just don't understand this stuff. But would your average person sit down and decide to read a 60-page report? Probably not. But they believe it's an issue, but how much they actually know about it. And I think the education part of this is really important.
What do you think we can do, well, I guess us as an industry, but with your perspectives as well, gentlemen, to help organizations understand what belonging means to them and actually what that means to their people, such that they can actually start showing some positive results in this area.
So the basic issue is that the city and the board and the C-suite have yet to fully appreciate the value creation power of a diverse workforce. And so the answer still is why not? And it starts with the city, starts with the board, and I think it starts with the board also. So imagine a CEO who has been given a well-documented lever that says, if you pull this lever, you're 35% more likely to outperform our competitors. 35% more likely to outperform our competitors, improve cash flow, and you don't pull that lever. As a chairman of the board, I would say that's negligence. That's negligence. What kind of CEO walks away from money on the table like that? So it needs to be part of the ecosystem. Every white man knows a white woman. And given that most CEOs are white men, the point is that women are part of the professional orbit. White women are part of the professional orbit of most CEOs, and white women are clearly part of the personal orbit. Every white man knows a white woman. Very few C-suite executives have an ethnic minority in their professional orbit, and even less so in their personal orbit. So there's a distance, there's a lack of understanding, there's a stereotyping, and to Wayne's point, there's a lack of education just by the lack of contact. And the other part, and it's the other issue around the gender versus the ethnic minority gender, is that there's no social accountability in your personal orbit for ethnic minorities.
Mm-hmm.
You go out to dinner, you go home as a white male executive, you have a daughter, you have a mother, you have a sister, you have an aunt. Someone at the dinner table might say, hey, what are you doing about that 30% club sort of thing? And where are you on that? Because ethnic minorities are not part of that personal orbit, there's also no social accountability. I don't have to answer to anyone in my social circles around BAME progression and retention. So it's a long-winded answer, but there is no one answer. But those are some of the realities we first have to face.
We worked with a private equity company in New York who asked me to go and talk. They've got 25 companies they own, to go and talk to the 25 CEOs about engagement and change, right? So I'm interested because I've never yet come across a private equity firm who are prepared to fly me all the way to California to talk to their 25 CEOs about employee engagement. As you said, this is not something that the analysts really talk about on analyst calls. When I was talking to the managing partner of the firm, I was like, how come this is a thing? And he's like, well, we realized that actually when we've done the employee engagement surveys, one of the lowest scoring questions, and I used to find this in all the companies we'd looked at, was the question which said, I've got skills the organization could use, but doesn't. I've got skills the organization could use, but doesn't. So in a weird way, I'm paying, $50, $100 million on this payroll bill for all these human beings. And I've got 60, 70% of them saying that they're underutilized. The weird thing is people are saying that they're overworked, but also underutilized at the same time. So he was saying, look, what we kind of figured is maybe it would be a smart way to take off the layers of gender, diversity, everything, and just look at it from a skills perspective.
There is a skills issue, but I think there's a skills gap. And so again, it's blunt, but it's true, is that you have a overwhelmingly white HR function trying to upskill an overwhelmingly white C-suite function. And so the understanding of the lived experience of Black and Asian staff, the issues of how do we engage, what are the real issues, on an individual basis. I think if you wish, that is part of this, that's I won't say that's a skill per se. I would take it a different way, ways we talked about before. It's an organizational blind spot. This is a UK conversation, which is very interesting because it's bar ITV 3 weeks ago. There is no FTSE 100 company that has a group head of diversity and inclusion reporting directly to the CEO. Calvin McCall and Addie Ratcliffe 3 weeks ago announced that was going to be part of their transformation. Only one FTSE 100 company. And that's only in the last 3 weeks. It is I would say it's a common feature in the US that you have sitting on the executive board a head of group, global group diversity. I mean, one of my current clients in the public domain, Warner Music, just hired a great head of global D&I. He sits on the executive committee reporting to the CEO. Marva Smalls, one of the great D&I practitioners in the US of Viacom CBS. Marva reports directly to Bob Backish. So it is a UK. So when we talk about why don't they believe the data, we have, and see, and this is what makes the argument even more complicated, is that the CEOs in the US believe the data. Is it skill? Is it racism? Is it discomfort? Is it a lack of proper advisors?
But I think there is also something in there around discomfort, Frank. You just mentioned it there. Talking about people issues, having done what I do for as long as I have, always in that people universe, these are always the very difficult issues to talk about. And I wonder if it's because people are scared of saying something wrong or offensive, or I think they recognize they don't know the answers, but don't know how to appear ignorant in front of their colleagues, although their colleagues are probably feeling much the same in many instances. So it's, what I find quite difficult to understand is why colleagues and C-suite members are not actually holding each other to account where they would be on many other metrics. But for some reason, there's something around the people agenda and anything that has to do with more emotive subjects where there isn't a black and white and there's an awful lot of grey, that feels difficult. But it's not okay for it to not be talked about in the first place. And I don't really know what the answer to that is either, other than, and you mentioned it, Frank, governance, who is holding who to account, and therefore potentially putting it onto the non-execs and asking them to hold organizations to account. So put it onto the shareholders even, to hold organizations to account. But one of the things that I started thinking about, and when you prompted this from the educational angle, is we use reverse mentoring in organizations for helping CEOs to get up to speed in what the latest digital fad is.
Yeah.
Why aren't we doing more of this for issues like people and diversity and different ways of thinking? I mean, is that an answer?
I'd worked back and forth in Netherlands, I'm sure, as Frank has for many years too. And I thought I really understood Dutch people because we had, I'd worked for years with Dutch people, but then I went into partnership with a Dutch business. And then it took me 2-3 more years, and I realized I really didn't understand Dutch culture at all. And I realized how different we were, and I thought we were so alike at the beginning, and all the wonderful things you learn, but you only learn the more layers you peel back. Mm-hmm. And it takes a long time to learn about that culture. And I know that there's certain things now I can say or do that would really excite them versus the Turkish guys versus the guys from Bahrain. But, you only get to learn that through that intimate, long-term relationship in a way that you start to build. So I think reverse mentoring in a way, if people could meet someone for a regular period of time that's a great way to do it. It's a great solution, practical.
Yeah, I would agree. There's usually 4 major things that block change. One is the strength of culture. The other is the rigidity of the structures. The other is kind of, I call it the myth of sunk costs. We've already invested a lot in this. We can't, undo that. And then entrenched interests. And so I would say, for my HR colleagues, ask yourselves each one of those and how do you address this particular issue in those 2 boxes. And then the other 2 are when it comes down to the individual, what blocks a change is that it's a lack of perceived benefit. What do I get from this? And it's the lack of context. And that's, I think, ultimately is why on the ethnic minority, the Black and Asian ethnic minority agenda, companies have failed because the white male is viewing this as a zero-sum game. It would be great if if the CEO stops being the torch carrier for this and the CFO. And you got to approach this as you do any change. It's not an initiative. It's not a moment. It's a change process, and you have to apply the same discipline to it.
It would be unrealistic to say of the FTSE 100 or any group of 100 CEOs that all 100 of them are and should care about it. Many won't, for their own reasons, couldn't care less. And that's a cold, brutal fact of it. I think the challenge for talent is perhaps to work out what organizations do care about it, because why would you want to employ your talent in an organization that doesn't care? And you can probably tell, you get a good read early on in terms of the culture of the organization, don't you, as talent, to say, actually, I can thrive here, and you vote with your feet.
How do you feel, both of you, about the definition BAME?
I hate it. Because it's another, but my personal view, it's another continuum. I mean, I put a post on LinkedIn a while ago about this, sort of in the 70s, I was this, in the 80s, I was, in the UK anyway, in the 80s, I was coloured. Then I became black. Now I'm Bain. It's like, what the hell? I personally, I hate it. That's my view anyway.
Mm-hmm. What would you prefer? How do you self-identify?
I don't know, just Wayne would be easier. And that was my point. Hopefully in the future I'm just Wayne.
I think that's absolutely valid.
That'd be lovely.
Absolutely. Frank? You are Frank, of course.
Yeah, I don't really, I think as a diagnostic term, it's wrong because they are different lived experiences and they have different dynamics. So from a diagnostic point of view, I think it's the wrong terminology. From a personal point of view, I'm kind of with Wayne in the beginning, but not with him at the end. I was born in Mississippi, so, I was colored at one point. I was a Negro at one point. I was black at one point. I was African-American at one point. I was a person of color at another point, and then I came over here and I'm BAME at another point. Just make it descriptive and respectful, and I'm fine. I think, like I said, from a diagnostic tool, I think it's wrong. From a personal tool, I've been called, 5 of the 7. I'm relatively comfortable with, like I said, as long as it's respectful and descriptive, but it's wrong as a diagnostic term.
Yeah, understood. Actually, I read something, I don't know if you saw this as well, Wayne, or maybe it's more common in the literature, that they used during the McKinsey report, which I'd not heard before, which was non-majority representation. So rather than actually highlighting the minority element of it, they just said it was non-majority. And that for me just felt like it was broader, it was less descriptive, it got less of a sort of put you in your box, put you in that box, put you in the other. It was just everything that is the non-majority, where ordinarily the majority in most instances would have been white, probably male, but definitely white.
And I think that's an excellent point, because that is the way we should look at it on a global basis. Because clearly BAME is not an exportable terminology globally.
Indeed.
And so in any country, it's always who's the dominant culture and who's the underrepresented culture. And that's the diagnostic tool. If you can't change the leaders, you change the leaders.
Yeah. Arguable. Wayne, anything to add?
No, I'd agree with that.
There's an observation here from the chat, actually, I just wanted to share more broadly, which goes back to the labelling and what you call it. And we do spend a lot of time talking about underrepresentation. As Debbie Ryan has suggested, how about we just talk about the overrepresentation of white men in the C-suite? Just change the vernacular a little bit. It's like, what are we going to do about the oversupply as opposed to the undersupply?
Yes.
I think that's a really nice way of putting it. And I think, there is also something in there that we as a recruitment industry have a role to play in terms of holding our own clients to account, and not just doing the tick box exercises. We're going to have, X percentage of representative candidates on the shortlist, whatever it happens to be, and actually trying to remove as much as you can out of the system where you can make subconscious biased decisions. And in many instances, I'm not entirely convinced they're subconscious either, which makes it worse. But I know that we as a firm are trying to do what we can with some various tools that we're looking at to try and support our clients in this, but there is ever more work to do. Another observation here, the BLM movement has ignited passion on a personal level globally for so many, which is helping to drive this forward. And I would definitely concur with that. So thank you for that, Nicola. Another question just come in. Yeah, good point, Alexa. In the recruitment industry, you need to have diverse representation in your consultant base that goes in to see clients. I absolutely agree. I don't think Wilton and Bain are doing well enough at that, and it's something we're certainly looking at, and we'll hold our hands up to that, both as a firm, but also as part of the wider industry. Couple of minutes left. As summary observations, I was just going to turn to each of you just as a sort of 1 minute sort of summary of where you feel we've got to in the last sort of better part of an hour discussing the topic. Wayne, can I go to you first?
Okay. I guess my utopian view, my hope would be that organizations can take a smarter view of understanding that it's talent that will be the big differentiator, and actually not just talent, but also that your organization, your service, your product has now got real world utility. one of the things that we've seen shake out in certain markets is companies that don't have utility, they're not valuable in the sense that they're not needed anymore, have gone. So it's the most fundamental shake-up of so many markets we've ever seen on the planet, including what we're seeing in the stock markets too.
Yeah.
And it should prompt CEOs and leaders to think differently now about the shape of the organization and the intellect that's needed. A big barrier, I think, damaging an organization's ability to harness that talent is this old world thinking about what that people apply to people from different ethnic groups. And the way to get over that and solve it is by increasing the number of people in your orbit. You've got to be proactive enough to want to go out and create new relationships, educate yourself, and then you stand a chance of being able to leverage the intelligence of the people in your organization. Without that, again, maybe what we're saying, your organization won't survive, because organizations have to change the way that they're doing things. So my hope is that CEOs see that. I guess accessing this data is a start. Watching this is a start, because I think it will educate a lot of people about how different aspects of this. I am hopeful. I'm a glass half full type of guy, and partly because a lot of the places we go and work around the world, as much as we have these difficult arguments and conversations here, on balance, given I think what Frank mentioned with Nigeria, I've been to so many countries where you look at the leadership teams of all those organizations, you don't find anyone else other than from that country, and generally male too. So the fact that we're even having these conversations is only a positive. It won't get solved today. It won't get solved, in the next few years, but it's wonderful that we're talking about this. Brilliant.
Absolutely. Thank you, Wayne. Frank?
So on the social accountability issue, for everyone on this call, here's what I want you to do. Next time your CEO has an all-hands town hall meeting, ask them, do you believe a Black or Asian or ethnic minority person can become the CEO of this company? Yes or no? And if they say yes, then ask them, what are you doing about it? That's all I ask.
Thank you very much indeed, both Wayne from the Global Growth Institute, Frank from Kairos Executive, for taking the time to share your thoughts today, to do so in such a candid and open and honest way as well. So from behalf of Wilton and Bain, thank you for your time, and we hope to regroup at some point in the future.